As part of looping, there are a couple of key words that we can use within our loops, whether it be a for loop, a while loop, or a do while loop, where we can interrupt the natural flow of the for loop, even if the condition for looping has not been met. In other words, if the condition has never equated to false yet to break us out of the loop, we have ways of getting out of the loop and or overstepping one of the iterations in a loop based on something that happens in the code that we're running. Now, that explanation may not make too much sense right now, so let's jump into some examples that will help you understand what I mean by that. So let's start off with the break keyword. The break keyword, what it allows us to do is it terminates the current loop and then transfers control back to the statement that follows the terminated loop, or the terminated statement, actually. So let's go ahead and let's see what that means. Let's see what it means. So let's get ourselves a variable. Let counter equal 0, and then we're going to use a while loop. While counter is less than 5, let's do something. And in here, normally, we would do something like a console.log, and let's log out our counter. Let's just log out the counter. Let's make sure we know it's the counter. So let's just say counter equals this. All right. Okay, so we've got our counter. And then we need to, of course, increment our counter. So let's do counter plus plus. Now, this is where break comes in handy. So let's say that within our program, we want to make sure that if we run into, or when our counter reaches, let's say 2, so let's say when counter equals 2, we want to go ahead and break out of the loop. So let's go ahead and see what this does to our actual loop. And right here, I've got our good old-fashioned console.log that shows that we've broken out of the loop and we've moved on to regular execution. And I'm going to go ahead and comment this out so we're not confused by the old code that we have in here. And let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Here you can see we're trying to iterate to 5 and we're starting at 0. So in a normal looping structure, we would see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the loop would terminate, and then we would see our outside of the loop console.log message. Here, though, what we're seeing is when our counter gets to 2, we are breaking out of the loop. And when we break out of the loop, we are breaking completely out of the loop, and we are stopping that loop from continuing to execute. Now, in this contrived example, you may not see a need for this because we're simply dealing with a counter, a number of times we want something to execute, and this code, yes, if we wrote this, we are guaranteed that every time we hit 2, we're going to break out of the loop. Where this comes in handy is if we are iterating over data and we know how long our data set, maybe we have a list with 5 items in it, and we're iterating over it, if we were to run into a specific data item we're looking for, and we don't want to continue because that would be a waste of time or a waste of computing power and cycles, and we just want our application to continue on, we can use the break keyword to break out of our loop and move on with our application because we found what we wanted to. In other words, it just gives us an easy and early way to break out of a loop if some condition is met that we're looking for. And it really comes in handy when we're talking about iterating over arrays. So what we're going to do is, here I've given you an introduction to break and how it will break you completely out of a loop and stop executing this code. In other words, we're not seeing it printed anymore, and it moves on to the rest of the code. We will see how break and continue, which we're going to learn about in a minute, applies to arrays and how we can really use that in data. And we have to learn arrays first before I can show you how this is going to be really applicable to arrays. So we'll revisit this when we get to arrays. So now let's learn about continue. Let's take the code we've got right here. Let's just come up with new code. Let's go ahead and write new code. So we already have counter up here. Let's just modify this code. That's even better. So let's go ahead and say loop. We're doing breaks and loops and continues and loops. So here we've got a break condition. Let's go ahead and see what happens when we switch this from break to continue. And let's see how our output changes down here. Let's go ahead and execute it. Well, we got ourselves what looks like an infinite loop. So we are infinitely looping now inside of our loop. So let's stop that so that we don't end up crashing everything. And let's take a look at what continue does for us. So the continue statement, it terminates the execution of a statement within the current iteration, which means when we do this, we're in iteration 2 when we start to hit this and continue gets executed. And when that happens within that current iteration, the looping continues the execution of the loop at the next iteration. And so what is that? Why do we end up with an infinite loop? And that is primarily because when we hit continue, the rest of our code in this block, which happens to be our incrementer that increments our counter, it never gets executed, and the while loop jumps to the next loop. Well, because our incrementer never got incremented, our counter stays at 2, so we end up at 2. And so we keep seeing it printed out as counter 2, and our condition is if counter equals 2, let's continue. So then we go back up. And that's what creates our infinite loop right here. So if we remove this counter incrementer and we move it up to right here, and we make it a part of the beginning of our code block, so that when our continue gets executed, it really does move to the next loop based on our counter. And if we run this, we'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is because our counter is incrementing at the top of our loop, and we are getting that done correctly. We're now getting that incrementation to happen. So this is in a while loop. We see that we still got through 1 through 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And our counter started at 0, but because we're incrementing at the top of our loop, we're still getting through all 5 increments. So what we can do is let's go ahead and change this to a for loop. And let's use a for loop. Let's do for let counter equals 0. And then we're going to do counter is less than 10. And then we're going to go ahead and increment our counter. Now that all of this is handled by our for loop, let's go ahead and let's do a check on our, let's check on our counter, and let's see that when it gets to 2, we want it to just go ahead and continue on with the next loop. So we're going to go ahead and set it to continue when we reach, let's not do 2, let's do 4. And then down here, let's go ahead and do a console.log, because this is going to happen after or at the bottom of the loop. And if continue does what we just said it does, if it stops right there and then goes back for the next loop, we actually should only see this console.log logged when it completes, when this condition does not get met. So let's do console.log, and we are going to go ahead and let's print out where we're at on each of our counters so you can see where and how this works. So we've got our for loop, we've got everything else commented out. Let's go ahead and run it. All right, we get a 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now if you notice, we're missing 4. The number 4 never actually shows up. And that is because in this for loop, because of our counter, our condition, and our incrementer are all managed by the loop for us, when we get the counter to have the same value as 4, which is what we're looking for, we hit continue, which means immediately we go to the next loop in the looping structure and we begin to execute the next loop. And because 4, when we reach 4, we're going to continue, this line never gets called when the 4 is encountered. And that's because we're bypassing everything in our loop and starting the next loop. So where is this useful? This is useful when we are incrementing over a list of data and we run into something in our list that we really don't care about or we're not worried about processing. In other words, we're going through a list, trying to sort it, and we're only trying to find items that begin with the letter A. So we may do a check against the letter A in each item we're pulling from the list, and if it doesn't start with the letter A, we don't care about it. So then we would hit continue and move on to the next item. So that's kind of an example of where we might use it. So we've got a basic idea of what break does and a basic idea of what continue does. Now we're going to jump into nested loops, and then when we get to arrays and we really learn about arrays and iterating over a list of data using these looping structures, we'll figure out how we can use break and loop in those situations in a little more detail.